So it's a great pleasure. I'd like to introduce Molly James, who's with me. She actually is a geographer, so she's bravely come to work with some social psychologists, and she also has a background, I think, as I mentioned earlier, in science and technology studies. So how technology comes into being in its relationship with society, which is an important part of geography nowadays. And she's been analysing some of the stakeholder interviews that we've conducted, particularly in the UK. So although the Emergent project is international in scope, we've been gathering interviews with a range of people in Britain over the last 3 to 4 years. And her job has been to kind of look at some of that data and try and understand what was going on there. So can I just ask you briefly, say a bit about the range of interviews and interviewees that you've been looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so I'm Molly James. I'm a research associate at Cardiff University. And I joined about a year ago when there was this big wealth of data collected a couple of years before that. And what I was really interested in is the broad sociotechnical system of enhanced rock weathering, because as a technology, it involves diverse sectors. So it was relating to mining or quarrying for the substrate. And then at the very end of the life cycle, it's related to agriculture. And so you have a very diverse set of sectors involved and many actors, including climate policy and carbon markets and a whole host of others.
Can I ask the question there, because you used a technical term, a sociotechnical system. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I guess it's principally interested in the relationship between technology and societal structures, so the governance and the publics involved, and so how this technology relates to actors and institutions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Why do you think it's important to think about this? I suppose you could call it the institutional level, isn't it? It sits below societal culture, and it's not really a hierarchy, and it sits above the very local concerns that people might have in the communities where enhanced weathering and carbon removal might take place. Mm-hmm. What's critical about this institutional level from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So we used institutional theory for this analysis. And I think, as I've just mentioned, we were interested in the relationship between actors, technologies, and institutions. And so institutional theory can really highlight the role of underlying norms and rules and assumptions and values and actor interests, and how these all feed into the technology and relate to the technology, and then the emerging institutions, because we're still in the infancy of it. So there's still a kind of range of possible futures and different governance systems and different institutions that can kind of manage and play a role in it.
So is the job of the researcher here to kind of steer those futures, or really just to try to alert people to the potential for those futures coming into being?
I wouldn't say, steer those futures, but I think this analysis can highlight the current system and where there's potential instabilities, where there's potential for harm, the distributional implications, because there's so many actors involved. And so, I think once we know actor interests and how these are contributing to the emergence of institutions, we can kind of, it raises questions, and we can then pose them to involve the actors, involve governance systems to then co-design.
Yes. Okay. So co-design. Again, that's another technical word. What in the area of technology studies, what does that sort of mean?
I guess it would be the participation of the actors involved in the design of the systems, and so incorporating their interests and ensuring a range of we are representing the actors involved.
So isn't that the idea, as I understand it, that is a sort of responsible development idea, but scientists and engineers can go away and come up with a really good idea, and they do work on it and they show it works, and maybe they've worked out there are some risks and lots of benefits, and therefore they would want to go ahead. But there are other interests that have to be taken into account, or other frames or ways of thinking about the problem, which scientists either aren't expert in or haven't really thought of.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's normative reasons for doing this responsibly, but also very instrumentally. Like, we if this technology is to be deployed, we want to highlight now if there's an instability in the system or if there's a distributional implication of one actor kind of shouldering more risk or not their interests not being met.
So what would be an example of I'm just thinking about the distributional implications and inequality that might come out of that. And I suppose you could argue people who live around mines, if the mining is going to be extended, and that will then impact that community. But of course, you're doing it to help the farmer further down in the chain of development of enhanced weathering. That would be an example of an equity that arises as a result that might not be thought about initially when you're kind of thinking about the technology per se.
Yeah, exactly. Potentially expanding mines or later down the line, the remediation of mines and potential environmental ills that come from that and the fungibility of it versus the carbon removal you're getting.
Yeah. I should say actually also that in fact the public perception work that we've been doing with Elspeth shows that people are concerned about local communities and lay publics are concerned about the remediation of mines questions. So it's interesting, isn't it, that actually both the stakeholders and lay publics raise that as a question for the confidence in the technology in order for it to go ahead.
Yeah, another example, I guess, of distributional implications when we're thinking of the wide range of actors involved is the role of agriculture. And so from our interviews, we found out that agriculture was very much interested in, firstly, a diversification of income. Secondly, kind of agricultural net zero and the ownership of potentially a carbon credit. And thirdly, the co-benefits, so agronomic benefits that might come from spreading the silicate rock on the fields. And so these were three interests, principal interests from the agricultural actors. And then we can look at this in comparison to the current mode of deployment, where kind of there's a carbon developer providing the substrate for free to the agricultural actor. And so the agricultural actor gains any agronomic benefits, but actually they're not gaining any carbon ownership for their net zero or agricultural sector net zero demands. And they're also not getting direct reimbursement for this. They're getting any potential profit from yield increases or soil. And so this actually came up back to the moral hazard question.
Okay.
Because agricultural as a sector, and similar to mining, is an potentially extractive and polluting sector. And so a wide range of participants saw that there's a potential moral hazard here if agriculture is selling a credit when they're not at net zero or at farm level or at sector level. Yep. So I think one interesting thing coming out of this is that if we can, I guess it would be called insetting when the carbon credit stays within the same supply chain. If agriculture can get some of the carbon ownership, I think that would actually kind of, be quite an innovative idea, and it would help, I guess, people interested in the sustainability or the net zero goals of enhanced rock weathering. But we know agriculture's got rising demands on the sector. They're interested in the carbon aspect, and so keeping that in the sector rather than selling it to a different actor who can potentially afford a higher price. Yeah,
because the agricultural sector, the analyses that obviously the Climate Change Committee and others do in relation to projections of carbon for, in our case, if you're thinking about the UK and your interviews, Molly, there is a sense in which agriculture is seen as quite a hard industry to decarbonise for all sorts of reasons. It's the artificial fertilisers they routinely use. It's the equipment and the use of fossil fuels in both transportation and on the farm. And so the moral hazard question sort of arises because why are they not dealing with that first before they do this, which is seen as a slightly more, I'd hate to use the word science fiction, but it's a less direct way of dealing with the problem of carbon emissions on farms, isn't it? So, that's partly the issue, isn't it? And
exactly.
Then there's concern, and again, there's concern in the public work we do with local communities that they want to see really strong action on conventional mitigation before enhanced weathering is actually deployed at scale. And I think you're saying that happens as well when thinking about the scale levels.
Yeah, exactly. And there's rising demands on the sector. So farmers, have to deal with food, biodiversity, carbon, water. These are all demands being placed on them. And then, so if we could help them meet one of those rising demands on the sector, and we could kind of figure, an alternative to the carbon market where agriculture could get some of the carbon ownership.
So thinking about the work you've been doing, Molly, one of the ideas you've been working with is something called institutional logic or institutional logics. And I know that sounds like quite a bit of a mouthful and a bit of a social scientist term. Can you say a little bit for the audience what you really mean by that, and what sort of logics have appeared or are there in the data you've been analysing?
Yes. Yeah. So we were interested in, I guess, the role of assumptions and values, beliefs, contributing to the emergence of institutions. And so institutional logics was able to, I guess, make this connection between actors and institutions. At its core is literally the logic of institutions. So why do people identify and orient towards particular institutions? For example, the state, the market, the environment, the profession. These are kind of typical institutional sectors, which you kind of see in different sociotechnical systems or organizational fields. But I guess the reason why we looked for institutional logics and used this theory is because it can really tell us about the meaning and coherence of the institutions in this field. And then we can, from that, derive the stability. And if there's some very obvious issues at this point in development that, potentially a different setup could solve. I think that's...
Yeah, but just to follow that up a little bit, because one of the things that's come out of that analysis is thinking about your state or your governance institution and the relationship between what's happening in the market, where there is some deployment now happening through the voluntary carbon market, that the state institution or the regulatory institution is lagging far behind, isn't it? So there's a tension between those two logics. They're not aligned, are they? I think that's my understanding of what you've been doing. So that would be a good example of that. And then also there's something also about, do the current institutional logics currently, I think I'd just put it simply, help farmers to deploy this in a reasonable or sensible way. And again, your work shows there are certain tensions, I think, there that would need to be resolved for this to be really rolled out at scale. I think you've already mentioned the question of who owns the credits. That's one of those tensions. So I think the institutional logics helps us to work out what adjustments might need to be made. I think that's the way I see it anyway.
Yeah. So we found 5 logics. Sustainability logic, which was interested in like societal net zero and the role of CDR and the moral hazard that we've mentioned, and also community, local community inclusion and impacts. Sustainability logic, agricultural logic, public logic, state logic, and a quantification and science logic. And from these, we were able to map the relations and then draw some key characteristics of the socio-technical system, and whether there's any tensions or synergies there.
Yes. And it's interesting, again, coming back to this question of why you do the social science and why it helps the natural science, that the natural science and our colleagues within the natural sciences, for all their great work, they sit within only one of those logics, which is interesting, isn't it? That it's the quantification and science logic. And they probably, not all of them would see some of the implications in those other areas, which would need to be aligned in order for this technology to be rolled out at scale, paid for by somebody, regulated by somebody, done in a safe way in a local place.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it was a big emphasis on quantitative science and quantification. And we know this is a big outstanding issue in ERW, is the monitoring, reporting, verification, and the measurement. This is important, whether it's going to be part of the public sector or the private sector. And so science, was kind of a key factor that was reinforced by all the different institutional sectors, was that we need this scientific development and we need these quantification instruments. But I guess one interesting part of it is, coming from our discipline, is that does this devalue more qualitative work or like local knowledges, like the farming knowledge? There was a big emphasis in the agricultural logic about local knowledges, and that farmers know their land, they know their practices, products, and if this was to bring these benefits, they would have found it out kind of years ago. And there was an emphasis on these networks of networks of knowledges between farmers with the same conditions, and kind of an emphasis on that. So yeah, it does kind of, we shift more into quantitative science and maybe lose the value of other forms of knowledge.
So given that this, and maybe this is sort of the final point that's come out of an interesting conversation, is obviously our science colleagues, one of the big challenges for them is to really try and decide, whether it's through a code or a set of procedures, what the monitoring, reporting, verification protocols should be, such that they are easy to use, simple, scientifically valid, all of those things that the scientists think about. But what you said is they also have to be able to fit in with the local conditions on a particular farm. And how does that work? And so that extends that analysis. I think that'd be the way to say that. And again, it's another interesting example of how the interdisciplinarity that's been built into the Levyhulme Centre is kind of helping the group as a whole to think about these things in a slightly wider way.
Yeah, another key part of the interdisciplinarity I found was that we know kind of farmer income was a big factor driving the interest in new technologies or enhanced rock weathering, and how that can be an additional income stream. And so subsidy schemes and that changing, or other forms of income, I think that's going to affect farmer decision making. And then whether we can communicate that to different disciplines to incorporate into models, for example, it might progress understanding of uptake and decisions.
Okay, well, that's brilliant. So I'd like to thank Molly on behalf of the whole Levyhulme team for talking about some of her work now. And I hope this has been an interesting podcast for all of you looking out there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.